Hey Rebels, welcome to Blasphemous Nutrition. Consider this podcast your pantry full of clarity, perspective, and the nuance needed to counter the superficial health advice so freely given on the internet. I'm Aimee, the unapologetically candid host of Blasphemous Nutrition and a double-degreed nutritionist with 20 years experience. I'm here to share a more nuanced take on living and eating well to sustain and recover your health. If you found most health advice to be so generic as to be meaningless, or so extreme that it's unrealistic, and you don't mind the occasional F-bomb, you've come to the right place. From dissecting the latest nutrition trends to breaking down published research and sharing my own clinical experiences, I'm on a mission to foster clarity amidst all the confusion and empower you to have the health you need to live a life you love. Now let's get started. Welcome back to Blasphemous Nutrition. I'm your host, Aimee, and I have really strong opinions that I prefer to hold loosely. Piggybacking off of last week's episode, I want to talk a little bit more about the labeling of foods as good and bad. At some point in time, we started moralizing what we eat. This happened before I was born, or at the very least before my memories became conscious. Before morality was interwoven into our meals, the focus of nutrition was about ensuring adequate amounts of foods deemed important for health, beginning with simply observing what healthy people ate, attempting to understand and extract components of these foods which created health, and then making an attempt to create recommendations to ensure that the United States had a robust army and healthy children. The initial USDA recommendations were based upon early work by a guy named Atwater, and they emphasized a diet with carbohydrates and fats for energy, protein for muscle building, and dairy products as holding high value for health. Calcium and phosphorus, which are prominent in dairy, had been identified as essential for health at that point in time, but their roles in how they kept the body healthy were still a mystery. And at the time that Atwater's initial publications were made in 1894, vitamins were still totally unknown. People, I cannot emphasize this enough. The field of nutrition is very, very new. There is more that we do not know than we know. Okay? We did not know vitamins existed in 1894. That is less than 150 years ago. So while we've learned a lot, we still don't know shit. When you think about how long we have been exploring physics or human anatomy or astronomy, the stars, and weather patterns even, when it comes to human nutrition and the constituents in foods which create health for the human body, we don't know jack. We're only 150 years into this. And this is why, this is really the foundation for this naturalistic bias that I have, where my default bias is going to go to what are the foods that allowed my great-grandparents to grow to adulthood. That's probably going to be a better food for me than whatever bullshit lab-created meat is being marketed to me right now as the way we're going to save the planet. All right. Tangent aside. Currently, in today's day and age, we have loaded our dietary staples with all sorts of identity signals and moral judgments. And granted, our food options have become vastly more abundant and radically different than they were 100 years ago. And so maybe some qualifiers are worth considering. However, there are other countries in the world who do not adopt this lens of what you eat having the power of granting you penance or forgiveness or being an act of sin or an act of purity? What is good and bad foods and clean eating if not some religious-like layer of holiness and sin that coats everything we eat? In an attempt to abandon this moral layer of consuming food, which is an essential act, the conversation, the initial rejection of this narrative, this morality narrative, looks a lot like hedonism, with many advocates of anti-diet culture returning to that tired, useless adage of everything in moderation. And while everything in moderation is a fine idea and well-intentioned, and honestly is definitely good guidance for my great-grandparents when they were children, it completely ignores the fact that we have billions of dollars invested in marketing and promoting hyper-processed foods, and it has so severely skewed the idea of moderation that I honestly do not think we can reliably lean on that guidance anymore. It is outdated and useless for the world that we live in today. Instead, what we need to do is return to this initial premise. What do humans need to thrive? And let that guide our decisions. That question pays no attention to moral judgments, but instead focuses on what has been scientifically studied to be optimal and ideal for human vitality, and then aims to create a diet focused predominantly upon these things. What a fucking concept, right? I mean, shit. Why does it feel like nobody's ever thought of this before? When we assess known essential nutrients and the amount of these nutrients that are currently recommended, a high produce diet with ample protein and varying degrees of starches and fats appears best. General avoidance of hyperpalatable processed foods is, at this point in time, wise. Research pretty reliably establishes that eating the standard American diet is only second to starvation as the worst dietary option for human health. The case for regular consumption of processed foods is only in rare occasions as a temporary means to avoid frank malnutrition, such as children who are struggling with sensory processing disorders, those who are on a very limited income and can only afford to get many of their calories from those heavily subsidized processed foods, or for individuals who struggle to consume enough calories in a day due to physical activity or surgery or disease. For the rest of us, these foods are, at best, an occasional accessory or a treat, making up less than 10% of our total caloric intake. Our current statistics show that over 60% of America's calories come from a combination of starches and fats. And so what I've just suggested would necessitate quite an overhaul for nearly all of us, to say the least. A couple of months ago, I went out for a 12-mile trail run up a mountain to this religious site with like a church and sanctuary and stuff where evidently the Virgin Mary had been seen by some farmers in the late 14th century, just your average Sunday. However, this Sunday morning was uncharacteristically warm for February, and I was slightly overdressed, so I was working a lot harder than I initially expected. About 4 to 5 miles up this mountain, I had consumed all of the food that I brought with me and most of my water, so I knew it was going to be a rough trip heading back down. And I paused for a moment and really weighed my options, and I knew the smart thing to do would be to turn around at that point, whether I was 4 or 5 miles up, I don't recall, and just head back down the mountain and forget about the sanctuary that day and try it another time. But I had been working all winter for months to build up the strength and endurance to get to the top, to get this far and run these 12 miles. And I really, really did not want to turn around. And against the little Jiminy Cricket on my shoulder telling me what the smart thing to do was, my ego won out. And so I kept on going and was just like, you know what? I'll hope for the best. I'm going to take it slow going down the mountain and be careful and not rush things. But I really want to get to this sanctuary. I really want to get my 12 miles in today. When I reached the top of the mountain, there was, the sanctuary that had been built, and it included this really stunning statue of the Virgin Mary, which I think was made in the 1950s. And there had been some statue in her honor at that site for several hundred years, but previous iterations had been burned or stolen or destroyed through all of the various wars and invasions that have happened in Europe over the years. So I reached the sanctuary and I climbed the steps. And at the top of the steps was this cafe where, your typical cafe items like sandwiches and soda and chips and things were served. Now, this is a perfect example of where hyper-processed foods, of which I chose potato chips and Coca-Cola, were of great help to my overall health. Now, neither of these items are things that I typically consider as food. As I've mentioned, I have a really strong naturalistic bias, and I favor minimal processing overall. However, on a very hot day, when I had been sweating for nearly 2 hours and was going to continue sweating for 2 more hours in ever-increasing heat, without liquid, without fuel, some sugar, caffeine, salt, and highly processed carbs are basically the perfect combination to get me down the mountain in good shape. These 2 food items had enough calories in them to fuel me and prevent fatigue as I was running down the trail. And therefore, they prevented me falling or twisting an ankle as I was going down. And the salt in the potato chips replenished lost electrolytes that I had lost through sweating. Had I chosen to lean with my bias and attaching labels of bad or feeling guilty if I were to consume these foods, I would have been in shit shape at the end of my run, if not injured. So it was a really good choice. And I actually had, instead of what I had worried about, which is a grueling, long slog down the mountain in the heat, I had a really good, caffeinated, juiced up run down the mountain and finished feeling really, really good. And I couldn't have done it without Coca-Cola and potato chips. Now, in the 21st century, most of us have grown up with these foods, potato chips, French fries, what we call junk food, right? They are well integrated into our holidays, our celebrations, our social activities, and many of them are also very deeply connected to our childhood. So while some people may easily be able to discard these foods in their quest to recover their health, most of us are going to struggle to some extent, because to eat is an emotional human experience. We cannot divorce the act of eating from pleasure, from nostalgia, from some of those amazing emotions that we have that make being alive worthwhile. Most of us are not able to do that. And so we have to learn how to coexist with these foods for the most part, because most of us will not be able to simply abstain. For a lot of us, abstinence of any kind of food or food group leads to feelings of deprivation that is ultimately unsustainable. And so moderation seems like the only solution. But what moderation means for you, for your physiology, is likely different than what you might think it is, especially if you are struggling with health issues or weight issues. Determining ultimately what is best for your body and how much of that is acceptable for your body is effectively a call and response exploration that can take months, if not years. It took me, personally, over 10 years to determine the appropriate amount of coffee that my body was willing to tolerate. And now I'm entering a phase in my life where I am going to have to revisit that question again, because my body and your body are not static things. They are constantly changing and adapting and growing throughout the life cycle, as well as in response to our environment. And so while it sounds so damn appealing to find a diet plan or a book that assures you can just set it and forget it, that's not likely going to be true for you throughout the entirety of your lifespan. You may find something that works for 2 years, for 5 years, even for 15 or 20 years, but it may not last forever. And if you're going through a massive change in your life, whether that change is hormonal or there's been a major shift in circumstances in your life which created a lot of emotional upheaval, your physiological response to food may have changed, and that may be why what worked before is not working now. So finding out what's going to be best for you involves far more than just a simple diet plan. And it is best sustained when not just your body's physical needs, but also your emotional needs and your psychological well-being are taken into consideration, right? Where is your happy place? Not just mentally, not just emotionally, but also physically. That destination looks different for each and every person. Like alcohol and cigarettes, I honestly think we should categorize junk foods into a place of, this is not helpful for my health or my weight, but it's something I have every once in a while. Just as there are some of you who feel like there is absolutely no amount of alcohol or tobacco that is worth consuming, there are some of you for whom these foods are also kept on an abstinence list, either because they make you feel like shit or because they lead to strong, persistent cravings that are decidedly not worth dealing with. Small amounts of hyper-processed foods can likely be tolerated by most of us a couple times a week, but much like alcohol, will likely exacerbate our health decline if we consume it daily. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this, categorizing these foods as the equivalent of tobacco or alcohol. I speak to this as an idea exclusively as it pertains to health. I mean, I understand that there's issues of access and affordability of unprocessed food, and it's a serious problem that makes execution of a healthy diet challenging for many. But that's not what I'm talking to in this moment. So do not fall for that fallacy of throwing out the whole idea because it's not realistic for everybody. Like, we cannot make any progress and move forward on any issue if we make those mistakes. There is some research emerging that suggests hyper-processed food does trigger addictive-like behavior in some individuals. And I'll be honest, that research totally strokes my confirmation bias. But this is associative research, and there is some mechanistic research that supports it, but we cannot establish this as causal, and there is not a lot of research out there yet. So it's an idea that is gathering steam, but it's not definitive. However, I will say, after talking with people about their cravings for over 20 years, there are definitely some people who appear to have a tendency to really struggle with moderating portions of certain kinds of foods. And you know who you are. I have never had to out you. Like, you all always are coming to me, telling me, usually you tell me that you have a willpower problem. What I can tell you is I do not think you have a willpower problem, even though you may feel that's the case. I'm pretty much convinced at this point, even before this new research came out, that there are certain genetic or neurochemical variations within some individuals that make it nearly impossible to moderate consumption of certain foods. Sometimes it's a broad category, like all sweeteners. And other times it's very specific to a type of food, like bread or pasta or chips. But it definitely exists. I've also clinically observed that these individuals often have a higher incidence of substance abuse within their families. And this may be a coincidence. However, I suspect there may be genetic tendencies to have stronger biologically driven cravings among some people. And if this is you, if this rings true for you, you may decide that there are certain foods which need to be off limits because for you, there is no such thing as moderation. Or you may look at that potential future and decide it is not reasonable to expect abstinence, in which case I suggest that you recognize consuming that food will cause a number of days or even weeks of struggle and cravings, and just face that fact, right? Okay, if I eat this food, this is the outcome. And I'm not going to hide that fact. I just need to expect that's how it's going to be. And then I suggest you create a plan for how you're going to handle that, either, on your own or with the support of a trusted health professional or coach. And this process of disentangling yourself from these foods that, I'm just going to say it, that you're addicted to, can take years. Because the mind of an addict is one that can convince you that you have control and you can handle it, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Now, we accept and understand and even have compassion for this when it comes to people who struggle to stay on their mental health medication or who struggle to abstain from controlled substances or illegal substances. However, this behavior is common for some people with some foods as well. Oddly, it is never for broccoli or cabbage. I just can't figure that out. So while I've deviated a bit from my initial premise, which is we need to stop moralizing our food by categorically referring to it as good or bad, yet when we look at the foundational principle of nutrition through the lens of getting the nutrients we need to thrive, we see that there are few scenarios in which the foods that are deemed bad are of value. We need to acknowledge they exist, but instead of passively judging or shaming people who struggle to make dietary changes, we would all be better served if we spent that energy working to increase access and affordability of produce and protein for people and make changes within regulation that eliminate non-nutritive foods such as Coca-Cola from WIC and other subsidized programs. Now, I can already foresee the workaround that processed food companies are going to make to fix the game in their favor, like adding essential vitamins to soda so that it qualifies as a nutritive substance. So alongside this needs to be an acknowledgement that the food itself has known as well as unknown nutrient value over simply qualifying some base constituents of that food like fiber and vitamins and protein as essential. Because a lab can make anything look healthy on a label, but that doesn't mean it is actually going to meet our nutrient needs or be the equivalent of something that nature created. There is simply too much that we do not yet know about nutrient needs for human vitality. So yes, there is a time and a place for things, including Coca-Cola and potato chips. But by and large, saying everything in moderation and leaving it at that is not going to get us healthier and is not going to improve things down the road. All right, folks, I'm going to call it quits for today. I would love it if you could send me an email at blasphemousnutrition@gmail.com. Let me know what you think of the episode. Or better yet, leave a review in iTunes. Share this show with a friend. And be sure to subscribe so that next week's episode gets dropped into your feed without you having to do anything. Thank you so much for continuing to listen. And I really want to thank everybody who has reached out to me personally to let me know that they are listening, because sometimes I feel like I'm just talking to myself and, maybe there's two people who tune in. So every time someone lets me know they're listening, I'm like, what? You listen? That's amazing. And it is. I do really, really appreciate it. Thanks again. I'll talk to you next week. Any and all information shared here is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not to be misconstrued as offering medical advice. Listening to this podcast does not constitute a provider-client relationship. Note, I'm not a doctor nor a nurse, and it is imperative that you utilize your brain and your medical team to make the best decisions for your own health. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked to this podcast are at the user's own risk. No information nor resources provided are intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Be a smart human and do not disregard or postpone obtaining medical advice for any medical condition you may have. Seek the assistance of your healthcare team for any such conditions and always do so before making any changes to your medical, nutrition, or health plan. If you have found some nuggets of wisdom, make sure to subscribe, rate, and share Blasphemous Nutrition with those you care about. As you navigate the labyrinth of health advice out there, remember, health is a journey, not a dietary dictatorship. Stay skeptical, stay daring, and challenge the norms that no longer serve you. If you've got burning questions or want to share your own flavor of rebellion, slide into my DMs. Your stories fuel me, and I love hearing them. Thanks again for tuning into Blasphemous Nutrition. Until next time, this is Aimee signing off, reminding you that truth is nuanced, and any dish can be made better with a little bit of sass.